At 7:44 a.m. in the Parisian suburb of Nanterre, a car was stopped by two police officers. The driver, a 17-year-old named Nahel, was at the wheel of a €70,000 Mercedes and did not possess a driver's license. In a normal city, he might have stepped out of the car, been arrested, and faced a minor sentence as a juvenile. But this was not a normal city. It was a banlieue, and Nahel refused to get out. One of the officers pulled out his gun, threatening him. As the car attempted to drive away, it crashed a short distance down the road. Despite the best efforts of medical first responders, Nahel was dead. In Paris, the policeman would have been arrested, an investigation would commence, and later, if deemed necessary, a trial would follow. Justice would be served. But this wasn't Paris. The police officer initially lied, claiming to have acted in self-defense. A video of the incident was leaked, and only then did protests erupt, leading to an investigation with the officer now facing a 30-year prison sentence for voluntary homicide. In a normal world, the promise of justice is often enough. But this is not a normal world. This is France, and this isn't the first time such an event has occurred. Welcome to Strategic Horizon, where we dissect the complex social and political dynamics that shape nations. But why did this incident ignite such a furious response, pushing France to a potential tipping point? We'll explore the deep social divides that fuel these recurring crises and reveal why the promise of justice often isn't enough. Before we delve into the protests, we must understand the protesters and the deep rift that exists within French society. At the heart of the riots are the inhabitants of the French banlieue. While initially just a word for an outlying area of a city, banlieue has come to signify segregated immigrant-descended communities on the margins of French society. They first emerged in the 1960s and 70s, born out of France's need for labor for its burgeoning industries. Companies like Renault or Peugeot traveled to rural areas of France's former African colonies to hire workers who were then housed in new urban developments surrounding major cities. While initially hired on temporary contracts, these were extended and became permanent as companies sought to retain skilled laborers. Families were brought over, and people began building lives. However, as France deindustrialized, its factories and mines closed down, cutting jobs. Many migrants who had come on the promise of opportunity found themselves jobless. To compound matters, the low educational background of these rural migrants made it difficult to change careers or integrate into broader society. Over time, some turned to making a living in a parallel economy centered around theft and drug trafficking, and the banlieues progressively became hubs of criminal activity. This parallel economy and the confrontation it generated with the police, in turn, led to the emergence of parallel societies where French institutions, including the school system and cultural values, held little sway and struggled to take root, making them fertile ground for extremist ideologies. Successive waves of both legal and illegal migration since then mean that roughly 5 million people, or about 8% of France's population, live in approximately 700 banlieue areas. The split between these communities and broader French society is much wider than in other Western European countries that also welcomed migrants during the same period. In French, this divide is commonly known as la fracture, or the rift. On one side of this divide, there is a secular French majority with a Catholic heritage, and on the other, there are the mostly immigrant-descended communities of the banlieues, a significant number of whom are Muslim. While some might attribute la fracture solely to systemic racism and religious differences, it is much more complex. It is true that job applicants with foreign-sounding names are less likely to receive interview invitations, and this disadvantage also applies to applicants with addresses registered in the banlieues. Today, 20% of people born from foreign parents and 23% of Muslims in France entirely agree with the statement that societies like France, which have a colonial past, were and will remain racist. The rift is primarily a socio-cultural divide, rather than one based solely on ethnicity, especially considering that France has always upheld the aspirational principle of equality ingrained in its national model, while simultaneously expecting far greater levels of cultural assimilation from newcomers and their descendants than in other European countries. This is particularly evident when it comes to religion, where laïcité, the French conception of secularism, involves the removal of religion from the public space. The problems affecting France at large are amplified in the banlieues, where youth unemployment is double the already high French national average. The French educational system, which has also struggled in recent decades, is under even greater pressure in the banlieues, where diverse cultural backgrounds make teaching more difficult and teachers are routinely mistreated and assaulted by students. For much of the past few decades, news headlines have presented two competing narratives about the banlieues. The first portrays them as a forgotten, left-behind part of France that needs assistance. The second depicts them as a lost France, or no-go zones, that supposedly need to be reconquered. However, when we examine the numbers, despite the perceived disconnect, the banlieues do not appear entirely forgotten, with 100 billion euros having been spent over the past 20 years in attempts to address their issues, alongside one of the most generous social spending systems in the world. Yet, the banlieues remain disengaged from French politics, exhibiting high rates of abstention in elections, which means they have little voice in national political debates. Feeling rejected by France, the banlieues have developed a culture of defiance towards French institutions in general, but particularly towards the police, with whom there are high levels of mutual distrust. This brings us to the protests and riots. I know what you might be thinking. The French are always protesting. It's a national sport avidly covered by news stations across the world. While that may be true, we need to examine how different these protests were from the 2018 Gilets jaunes protests or even the previous nationwide banlieue riots from 2005. If we look at the timeline of the largest protest movements at a national level in France over the past 30 years, we see that large protests regularly occur over legislation, with retirement age and public sector reform being major triggers for the French to take to the streets. These protests, mainly comprising public workers, the lower middle class, and trade unionists, react to their political news cycle. They have also seen significant rioting and looting, with the 2018 Gilets jaunes protests causing nearly as much damage as the 2005 banlieue riots. However, the banlieue riots involve a different demographic, have different triggers, and usually do not take place in the same areas. Yet, they follow a relatively consistent dynamic, which is important to understand for the rest of this story. First, there is a period of tension at the local or national level as the state cracks down on the criminal economy. Then, an incident resulting from excessive police force leads to one or several deaths. This event is perceived both as racially motivated and an attack against the community, sparking a riot that causes severe damage to city infrastructure. More police are deployed to contain the protests, which eventually simmer down after a few days or weeks. Finally, the government introduces some kind of plan to rebuild the city and makes pledges to address the banlieue's problems. Yet every time this happens, there is an escalation of violence and prejudice, which only increases repression by the police and the intensity of the rioters' actions. The crucial difference this time is that until recently, riots in the banlieues were largely confined to those areas. While previous riots received extensive media coverage, their relative geographic isolation meant they could, for the most part, be ignored by the wider public. The primary victims of these riots were the people, businesses, and public services within the banlieues themselves, where most of the buildings and cars went up in flames. However, for the first time in June and July 2023, riots made their way to city centers in places like Paris and Marseille. A whole segment of French society, for whom the riots were merely a distant occurrence or something they saw on TV, is now confronted head-on with this new reality. As a result, there has been a massive surge of support for the usually unpopular police, a shift to the right in public opinion, and a hardening of public discourse. In response to the riots, two police unions declared themselves at war with hordes of savages, with some on the far right calling it the beginning of an ethno-religious conflict. The banlieues can no longer simply be neglected as they have been in the past, both for the criminality they harbor and for the poverty of their citizens. The failure of French immigration policy over the past 40 years is not only on display, but is also having profound domestic consequences, with nearly 1,000 protesters arrested during the recent unrest. To tackle this complex problem, there appear to be several possible, complementary courses of action the government could take to improve the banlieues, repair la fracture, and eventually integrate or assimilate their inhabitants. France could undertake the task of reforming its police force, which has become less selective and shortened training times over the past decades. This reform could help avoid some of the incidents and address its very real statistical and thus racial profiling problem. However, such a move would likely prove unpopular with the police, who have repeatedly refused accusations of racism. Another course of action would be to attempt to crack down on the criminality that undermines the banlieues and contributes to tension with the police. But this would involve a doubling down on repression, which in every previous riot has proved to be a failed recipe and would likely trigger further unrest. Finally, France could look to change the dynamics of the banlieues through urban planning to better connect them with the rest of the country. But the truth is, between 1977 and 2018, there have been no less than 10 plans to improve the conditions of people living in the banlieues, where the government has spent vast sums on what many have called uninspired fresh coats of paint on top of a failing system rather than implementing structural reforms. The recent riots have made it hard to justify helping out areas and people that burn their own buses, their own schools, and their own libraries. Ultimately, none of these proposed solutions would fundamentally change what appears to be the underlying problem: France's model of integration and how generations of migrants and their descendants have responded to it. This means rebuilding a system with more opportunity, doubling down on education, and perhaps even changing how France relates to newcomers. In fact, the problem has festered for so long that for France, it will require immense political will, significant financial investment, and most importantly, time to mend the rift. The French public is angry. Their cities have now been attacked, not just by Islamist extremists coming from the banlieues, but as they will perceive it, by the banlieues in their entirety. This has been a massive psychological shock for France, and the political consequences will be equally massive. While France's 2027 presidential elections are still 4 years away, these riots have started a countdown, and France's centrist political forces will need to find a sustainable solution before time runs out. If you are interested in how the cycle of violence discussed in this video happens, I would recommend two French movies, La Haine and Les Misérables, which delve deeper into this topic from an artistic point of view. Thank you for watching Strategic Horizon.